Hello, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's event hosted by the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. I'm the BCLT's academic director. My name is Duncan Large. As with previous events, this seminar is being recorded, and the recording will be available soon on BCLT's YouTube channel, where you'll also find recordings of previous events from BCLT. We've organized this event in collaboration with Professor Aninja Cheka Purakayastha from Kazi Nazrul University, who is our current Charles Wallace India Trust Translator Fellow at the University of East Anglia. For the last 25 years, BCLT has welcomed Indian translators and scholars to Norwich under this Charles Wallace Fellowship scheme. This year, unfortunately, for COVID reasons, we've had to move this residency online and make it a virtual residency, but we're delighted that we could nonetheless go ahead with this year's residency, even under these conditions. So Aninja Cheka Purakayastha has been working virtually with us over these last 3 months on a project titled Versifying Cosmopolitan Hope Amidst the Wounds of Time, translation of the Kallol era poets. And this afternoon's roundtable then is on a topic which is very dear to his heart: politics of untranslatability, Bengali poetry as literature of the world. So the aim of our roundtable this afternoon is to try and situate the translation of Bengali poetry, particularly into English, in the context of what one might call the world literature debate. Emily Apter rightly argues, quoting Derrida, that the history of translation cannot be delinked from the history of proselytism and forced conversion, a world system in which Globish, global standard English, is imposed on us as our absolute habitat, conferring on it its undisputed monolingual sovereignty. Is translation a hegemonic exercise that glosses over multiple non-English specificities, or what Barbara Cassin has called the untranslatables? How can translation meet the challenges of, quote, incommensurability, non-equivalence, the history of violent erasure, and nonwords, or the effects of non-translation? And that's quoting from Emily Apter's afterword to the collection, The Work of World Literature Towards a Theory of Reparative Translation, which is linked from the Eventbrite page for this event. Is translation akin to Lyotard's idea of the differend, a conflict zone left unsettled, unanswered? Is translation therefore a facilitator of Globish, a tool of monolingualism? How do we strategize a renegade translation heuristic when we trans-iterate minor or micro literary texts? This is a series of quite substantial big questions. How can mistranslation, non-translation, or a resistant model of translation weaponize against the world systems of literary translation? How do we translate the untranslatable? That's perhaps the biggest question of all. And this seminar then is going to situate all these questions within the context of translating modern Bengali poetry, or Kallol era poetry, to be more precise. The Kallol poets were brilliant literary interlocutors of the world, being Bengali avant-garde practitioners. They wrote during the interwar period, a time strikingly similar to our own conjuncture of human conflict and the rise of neo-fascist authoritarianism. So that's by way of, to give you a flavor of some of the angles which we'll be exploring this afternoon. And to do that, around our virtual round table, I'm delighted to be joined by Aninja Sekar Purukayastha himself and three other distinguished scholars to discuss these questions with us. And they are Liesl Schwabe from Yeshiva University, Shupriya Chowdhury from Jadavpur University, and Emily Apter from New York University. So I will introduce our speakers in turn. We're going to hear first from Aninja. Before I hand over to him, though, let me just say that there will be plenty of time for questions at the end of the roundtable proper. We're using Zoom webinar, so do please use the Q&A function. There is the chat function as well, but the Q&A function allows you to upvote questions and to draw your questions to the particular attention of the panelists. So do use the Q&A button that's available now, and as is the chat. So do please let us know your thoughts as the roundtable proceeds. Our first speaker, though, is Aninja Sekar Purukayastha, and Aninja is Professor of English and Coordinator of the Center for Critical Social Inquiry at Kazi Nazrul University in India. Among his recent books are Literature, Cultural Politics and Counter-Readings, Hamlet as the Prince of Deconstruction, that's Routledge and Akar Books 2021, and Violence in South Asia, Contemporary Perspectives, which he co-edited from Routledge in 2019. His co-authored monograph on new social movements, media and civil society in contemporary India, and his co-edited volume on Deleuze, Guattari and Terror are forthcoming in 2022 from Palgrave Macmillan and Edinburgh University's Press, respectively. Aninja co-edits Kairos, a journal of critical symposium, and is one of the founding members of the Post-Colonial Studies Association of the Global South. So this semester, Aninja has been the 2021 Charles Wallace India Trust Translator Fellow at the University of East Anglia. Welcome, Aninja. Do share your thoughts.
Thank you, Duncan. And hello, everyone. I thank the BCLT, Duncan and Anna, and all the other colleagues associated with BCLT for organizing today's event, and my gratitude and thanks to the other panelists, Shupriya Chowdhury, Emily Apter, and Liesl Schwabe for being there in today's event. This roundtable comes as an outcome of my current research and translation project at BCLT, and it focuses on the interwar modern Bengali poets who are known as the Kolol era poets. The term Kolol can be translated or quote unquote mistranslated as dynamism or the upsurge of change or progress. Now, my translation project of these poets are very well known within Bengal, but largely unknown in the rest of India or across the globe, makes me look at them as what Emily Apter described as the politics of keeping some writings as specimens of quote-unquote lowercase world literature who have restricted entry through the quote-unquote uppercase institutional world literary border control or literary world systems that attempts, as Emily says, to revive world literature in its institutional guise. And that is why she is against such institutional models of world literature, which shows entrepreneurial bulimic drive to, as she says, to anthologize and to curricularize the world's cultural resources. Now, Emily has argued that this is a tendency, or a neoliberal tendency to be more precise, which zooms over the speed bumps of untranslatability. Now, she views this as a flaccid globalism that pays lip service to alterity, that strengthens neoliberal, as she says, big tent syllabi taught in English by incorporating representative text from different locations of the world. She prefers and calls for a reworking of literary history through planetary cartographies and histories, which translation studies in its existing avatar has perhaps failed to do. Now, Barbara Cassin, whose Dictionary of the Untranslatables, a philosophical lexicon, edited and translated and supervised by Emily Apter, motivated the subject of today's roundtable, as Duncan described moments back. Cassin argued that the title of her dictionary was inspired by William von Humboldt's introduction to his translation of Agamemnon of Aeschylus, which he translated, and he quotes Humboldt in this way, where Humboldt mentions the word untranslatable. And I quote, "Such a poem is according to its particular nature and in a manner quite different to what is generally said about all works of great originality, untranslatable." Now, Cassin remarks that although Humboldt found the tragedy of Agamemnon to be untranslatable, yet he decided to translate it, and that suggests how all translations remains to be retranslated. Now, the definition of the untranslatable that Cassin offers in her dictionary is very crucial, which is that the untranslatable is not what one does not translate, but what one never ceases to not translate. And translation, therefore, lies at the heart of the humanities. Now, I look into all these arguments as offered by Emily Apter and Barbara Cassin while focusing on my own project of translating from Bengali into English of the colonial era poets like Jibanananda Das, Nazrul Islam, and Jasimuddin. There are many others, but I decided to focus on these three figures for paucity of time and space today. I have already spoken in great detail about the colonial era poets in my previous research seminar, and you can have a look at it through the BCLT webpage. But for today's event, I would rather focus on the specific issue which we have already mentioned in the concept note. Now we look into few lines from Nazrul Islam from his celebrated poem Bidrohi, or The Rebel, is in order here. And I would like to read out the Bengali lines first. Ami Bedouin, Ami Chengiz, Ami Apunare Chara Korina Kahare Kurnish, Ami Bajro, Ami Ishan Bishane Onkar, Ami Israfiler Shingar Mohahunkar, Ami Pinak Panir Domru Trishul Dharmo Rajer Dondo, Ami Chokro মহাশঙ্খ, আমি প্রণব নাদ প্রচণ্ড, আমি খ্যাপা দুর্বাসা বিশ্বামিত্র শিষ্য, আমি দাবানল দাহ দহন করিব বিশ্ব, আমি বিধবার বুকের ক্রন্দন শ্বাস, হাহুতাস আমি হুতাশির। Now, these lines are embedded in complex mythological and intertextual connotations, which various mythic figures and objects like that I mentioned, figures like Israfiler Shingar or Pinak Pani, Domru Trishul, etc., etc. Now, all these mythical figures and objects challenge the translator with the task of translating the untranslatable. One gets similar examples from another text of Nazrul called Srishti Shukher Ullashe, which I have already translated as part of my translation project within this fellowship. And I once again read out from the Bengali lines first. আজ হাসলো আগুন শসলো ফাগুন মদন মারে খুন মাখাতুন পলাশ অশোক শিমুল ঘায়েল ফাগ লাগে ওই দিক পাশে গো দিক বালিকার পিত বাসে আজ রঙ্গন এলো রক্ত প্রাণের অঙ্গনে মোর চারপাশে আজ সৃষ্টি সুখের উল্লাসে. Now, in these lines, the expressions like quote unquote Modon Marer Khun Makhatun cannot be simply translated as afflicted or affected by the arrows of Cupid, or the expression like Rongon elo rokto praner ongone mor charpashe cannot be represented as my uplifted soul being encircled with crimson flowers. Rokto prane, this Bengali untranslatable word, has to be translated keeping in mind the differential connotation of blood or rokto or khun as representing various motivated homonyms that Barbara Cassin mentioned in her introduction to her dictionary. Now, I can go on quoting many such examples of the untranslatables from another Kololera, a prominent Kololera poet, Jibanananda Das, and I read out from his poems. যখন হলুদ মোটা শেফালির কোনো এক নরম শরতে ঝরিবে ঘাসের পরে শালিক খঞ্জনা আজ যত দূরে ওড়ে কতখানি রোদ মেঘ টের পাবো শুয়ে শুয়ে মণ্ডলের ঘরে. These lines pose similar challenge of the untranslatable. Expressions like holud mota shefali or norom shorote make or evoke complex life words which cannot be simply transliterated. And lastly, I read out from another prominent Kololera poet, Jasimuddin, known for capturing the rural and the subaltern life worlds of Bengal in his poem called Shak Tuluni. Contained in the anthology of Kolol poems, where he narrates the simple joy and placid beauty of rural Bengal, in which the term, quote unquote, Shak Tuluni refuses to be simply translated as the leafy vegetable gatherer. If I translate, literally the term Shak Tuluni, it becomes leafy vegetable gatherer, but this is not a correct translation in that way. He's more than that. The term or the figurine of the poor vegetable gatherer incorporates poverty, simplicity, placidity, non-calculus, non-consumption, and many more such homonyms. Now, this poem cannot just be translated to make it a part of what Emily Apter describes as quote unquote big 10 syllabi. One needs to first bow down before the pure simplicity and otherworldly charm of this life world of a simple leafy vegetable gatherer in a remote Bengal village, a solitary reaper of Bengal. The last two lines of this poem are amazing pieces of the untranslatables. And I quote, এমনি করে শাক তুলে সে গায়ের পথে চলল ফিরে, চলল যেন সোনার কলস ভাসিয়ে মাঠের সবুজ নীরে. The expression সোনার কলস in Bengali cannot be translated simply as the golden vessel, because that would miss the soul of the poem. The translator needs mistranslation or motivated homonyms here to do justice to these deeply philosophical lines in which the simple act of leaf gathering is transmuted into the sublime. I now come to the concluding part of my opening remarks. This whole argument and the logic of untranslatability, therefore, comes within the current debate, as Duncan mentioned, around world literature, in which literature needs to be rescued from, as Emily said, the de-aestheticizing jaws of globalization, arguing for a translational paradigm which Emily Apter claims can deliver surprising cognitive landscape hailing from inaccessible linguistic force. Such a model opposes the celebration of nationally and ethnically branded differences which are niche marketed as commercial identities. Barbara Cassin's idea of the untranslatable is used here by Emily as a deflating gesture that philosophizes literary history to the history of translation. She also mentions of Walter Benjamin's concern on the failures of translation, which she believes has not been much plumbed into. And speaking of the difficulties of translating, which Benjamin referred to, Emily referred to or mentioned the idea of glossolalia, of varieties of speech acts, of pure acts of uttering inarticulate sounds, something that Giorgio Agamben also mentions, a context that brings in Wittgenstein's concept of the nonsense or the unsayable or the inexpressible. Emily equates this unsayable with poetic opacity or schizo-language that defies any coercive model of forced translation or monotheism imposed by the imperium of global standard English. One may recall here Professor Shukanto Choudhury's brilliant translation of the celebrated Bengali poet Sukumar Roy's nonsense rhymes. I situate and conclude my project of translating Bengali poetry within this logic of the transnational international that confronts the challenge of posing Bangla poetry as literature of the world. I'd like to know from Emily and from other speakers of the roundtable, namely Supriya Choudhury, Liesl Scobb, and Duncan Laird, who is himself a renowned translator, on how to meet the challenge of what Emily said in her introduction to her Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability, of conjugating or reconciling Cassin's idea of linguistic relativism and Alain Badiou's idea of hypertranslation through democratic or demotic models of translation with subjective truth, or in how to meet or to marry logology with the Mathen, as Badiou said, with deterritorialized language, with the genius of language in one tongue. In other words, how to make Bangla poetry a lowercase world literature, getting entry through the systemic border control of uppercase world literature. Thank you. Over to you, Duncan.
Thank you, Aninja. That's already such a rich set of reflections and opening up a number of questions, which I'm sure we're going to be exploring in the rest of our roundtable. But I'd like to move on at this stage and introduce our second speaker, who Aninja already mentioned at the conclusion of his remarks there, and that is Supriya Choudhury, who is Emerita Professor of English at Jadavpur University in Kolkata, India. Supriya Choudhury was director of the School of Languages and Linguistics for a decade to 2013. She was head of the Department of English in the 1990s and coordinator of the Center of Advanced Studies at Jadavpur for a dozen years. She's held the posts of Assistant Professor of English at Presidency College in Kolkata for a decade, from the mid-70s to the mid-80s, and then reader in English at Jadavpur and Professor of English for the last 20 years before she retired in 2013. She was educated at Presidency College in Kolkata and the University of Oxford, where she took first-class honours in English from St Hilda's College in 1975 and a DPhil in English Renaissance Literature in 1981. 2006 to 7, she was one of the judges for the Commonwealth Literature Prize, and over the years from 2012 to 16 for the Crossword and Sahitya Academy Translation Prizes. Her areas of specialization are Renaissance studies, urban studies, and cultural history, philosophy and critical theory, cinema, sport, translation, narrative, and modernism. So a extremely versatile scholar. She has published widely in these fields, and she's translated for the series Oxford Tagore Translations. So welcome, Professor Choudhury.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Thank you, Duncan and Anindo, for asking me to be here. And my thanks to my fellow panelists, Liesl and Emily, for being here. Thanks to Anna for starting us all off. Anindo has already set out the terms of his inquiry, and I won't, embark on an examination of those questions precisely. I'll be focusing mainly on Bengali modernism, principally Kollol era poetry, and its engagements through translation with world literature. But I want to bookend this set of observations by starting with the compulsory world or worldly dominance of the English language, and ending with the publication in 1960 of the 100th centenary, you might say, issue of the modernist poet Buddhadev Bose's journal, Kobita, advertised as an international English language number and containing translations into English of poetry from 10 languages, 7 nations, and 6 decades, but the majority from Bengali. I don't need to explain to this audience that Buddhadev Bose, as a precocious adolescent, was among the youngest members of the radical Kollol group, contributing to its journal, which started publication from 1923, and that he later, in 1935, founded his own Bengali poetry journal, Kobita or Kavita. So let me start with those 2 points, the dominance of the English language, and end with Buddhadev Bose's issue of the journal in English, the 100th issue. Jean-Paul Nerrier's coinage, Globish, a reduced and simplified English accessible all over the world, should remind us of an earlier, more sinister version of this in George Orwell's dystopian fantasy, 1984, a book that we who live in India today should be reminded of all the time, where totalitarian state power and the ideology of INCAP, or English capitalism, is principally disseminated through the instrumentality of language, specifically a form of English called Globe Speak. Newspeak, but it's also called Globe Speak. I recall publishing an essay about this in 2000, the millennium year. Orwell's Globe Speak, or indeed Globish, may not coincide exactly with the subtlety and variety of global Englishes, some of them used in literary translation today. Indeed, it's closer to the more debased business or commercial English that appalled Edward Said as he traveled around the world, the English of the call center on which Susan Sontag commented with distaste in her celebrated lecture on translation, The World as India. Nevertheless, the point that Orwell was making in his novel written in 1949 had to do with power and with language as an instrument of power, capable of obliterating older meanings as it creates new ones. And I think that that point still holds. I want to hold this notion of language as an instrument of power in reserve as I turn to the Kollol era poets, heralds of a new age in Bengali writing from the 1920s and thereafter. And this was, as what I have earlier described, as one of the distributed centers of global modernism, responsible for radical innovations of the content and style of literature and art. Ideologically, Kollol, the journal itself and its founders and principal contributors, aligned itself to revolutionary politics, taking its stand beside, I quote, the outcast, despised masses in depressed middle-class households, in coal houses, slums, footpaths, in spaces of exclusion and abandonment. The Kollol office came under the surveillance of the colonial police when Qazi Nazrul Islam's Bisher Bashi was proscribed as a seditious work in 1924. Its authors, colonial subjects who knew the pain of a lost or stolen history, believed that the changes that were sweeping through their own literature and the literature of the world were at least partly caused by the tumult and suffering of the First World War, the Russian Revolution, and the influenza epidemic that claimed between 12 and 14 million lives in India alone, a grim thought which we should reflect on in our current pandemic age. These poets engaged eagerly with the literature of the world, or Vishwa Sahitya, Vishwa Sahitya, world literature, adopting a term given to them, though used rather differently, by the poet Rabindranath Tagore, reading and translating world literature and the literature of other Indian languages into Bengali for the numerous journals that they published from the 1920s onwards, like Kollol itself, Kalio Kolom, Progoti, Porichoy, Kobita, and several others. And all of these carried the modernist movement forward in Bengal from the 1920s onwards and embroiled it in the contesting ideologies of aesthetic modernism on the one hand and social or socialist realism as propagated by the Indian Progressive Writers Association, IPWA, and the Indian People's Theatre Association, IPTA, on the other. And, this is fairly well known that there develops a kind of contestation between social realism and high aesthetic modernism. It's discussed by Greg Barnheisel, for example, in Cold War Modernists. And during the Cold War, the CIA actually takes an interest in fomenting this divide. Anyway, so you find significant essays on European literature by Buddhadev Bose and other writers of the circle, and translation directly from European languages made by many of these Kollol era poets and scholars and published in their various journals. The editors of the journal Porichoy spoke of causing the thought streams of the world, old and new, to flow through the fields of the Bengali language. And this, vivid image, it's image, as it were, from the delta, the great Gangetic plain, where this kind of discussion and debate is going on. Chris Manjapra, who's worked on the Kollol magazine, notes that they correspond particularly with European writers and not necessarily with British ones. This translation practice constituted an immense stimulus to Bengali literature, which went through an astounding period of innovation, growth, and achievement in around 4 decades. But if there was dialogue in the Delta, was there, to use Pasquale Casanova's term, consecration in the metropolis? In fact, there appears not to have been. The only Bengali writer to have been so consecrated was Tagore himself, whose case is a bit of a puzzle to Casanova, and whose consecration, he received the Nobel Prize for Literature, brought a fair amount of translation from the poet's own Bengali into world languages, not just English, but German, French, Italian, Czech, Hungarian, Serbo-Croat, Russian, Chinese, Japanese, and so on. Tagore was translated into very many of the languages of the world. Yet the literary works of Tagore's younger modernist contemporaries, writing in a period of anti-colonial struggle, war, famine, and decolonization, many of them practicing translators themselves, remained relatively unknown to the world. And in India itself, the split between the high modernists and social realists also, produced constant disagreements in the literary world. It's very much a reality in the 1940s and the 1950s, especially with the rise of the Communist Party. Buddhadev Bose himself became a votary of the notorious ICCF, which is the Council for Cultural Freedom. Now, perhaps this made him more conscious of his isolation, and it might have been this imbalance, this one-way traffic, that was sought to be redressed by the 100th, the centenary, as it were, number of Bose's journal Kobita, published in 1960, which was projected as an international issue, an international English language issue. And it offered Bengali poetry alongside the works of other world poets in English translation in a single international issue, accompanied by a long essay by Bose's son-in-law, Jyotirmoy Dotto, on this very problem of the obscurity, the lack of world fame of Bengali poetry. Indeed, from the 1960s, and actually from the 1950s onwards, there were sporadic efforts to redress this imbalance. Bose's book, An Acre of Green Grass, published in 1949, Humayun Kabir's edited anthology, Green and Gold, Stories and Poems from Bengal, 1958, are signal instances of efforts made in this direction. But that the efforts remained sporadic, that Bose's international English language number of Kobita never created anything like an international stir, has, in my view, it doesn't really have anything to do with untranslatability in the terms that Onindo has just very brilliantly examined. I don't think that it is actually to do with the linguistic or semantic problems of translation, the philosophical problems of translation that lead to the decidedly minor status of this special issue of the journal, which is a Bengali journal, but is producing an English language number. The first lesson that translation teaches us is in fact the lesson of loss. This loss of meaning, of context, of resonance is the price that representation pays in order to deal in language at all. And it's, in linguistic terms, it's what Jean-Jacques Lassalle calls the remainder, something that constantly stages the return within language of the contradictions and struggles that make up the social. For Lassalle, this remainder is also the literary, unquantifiable excess of language, the surplus that linguistic analysis cannot explain. Part of the paradox of translation is that deficit and surplus are locked into the same process of, or the same operation of transfer. And it remains like a permanent deficit, something that we place on record but can't compensate. So I would, while I myself as a translator feel these problems of translating poetry, I don't think that the minor status of Bengali poetry in translation is actually to do with the problems of translating this poetry as opposed to translating any other. In my view, the fact that this great period of Bengali literature, and it's not just poetry after all, there's a great deal of wonderful fiction and drama that comes from this period, that it remains more or less invisible to the world or invisible in the world literature landscape has to do with conditions of visibility. And these are controlled by world politics and not simply by the local semantics of language. It's not just that Bengali has no leverage, no power in the international translation scene. It's also connected to, interwar and post-war politics, to the complicated politics of decolonization, the Cold War, ideological conflicts, non-alignment, poverty, the Third World. It has to do with particular histories, particular concatenations of world events, of notions of East and West, centers and peripheries that have produced what we think of as modernism or modernity or world literature. It's not even a question of what gets translated. It's what matters is what gets read and by whom it gets read. To redress this imbalance will require nothing less than a global state shift. But it's also true that sometimes the curtain shifts and things become visible. And I would hope that for Onindo, this will happen. Just as the cinema of Satyajit Ray was globally visible for a time, and now one might say it no longer is so, or is no longer so to the same extent. The literature of Bengali modernism, which actually sustained that cinema and made it possible, might also make an unexpected appearance on the world stage if it does so It might speak to us of past struggles and aspirations post-decolonization, from which we have much to learn. I think I'll stop here, and maybe we can come back to some of these questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There was such a lot there, which accounts for, in a sense, accounts for Aninja's project, for the need for the project which he's been doing in the recent months to compensate for this relative invisibility of such a large number of Bengali poets who are not Tagore. I think you've raised there some really incisive questions around what are the, as you put it, the conditions of visibility, and in particular the context for our invoking the very notion of untranslatability. Thank you for your mention earlier in your remarks as well of that essay by Susan Sontag, The World as India, which began life, of course, as a St. Jerome lecture for BCLT. Let's hear next from Liesl Schwaber. Welcome. Liesl is a lecturer in English at Yeshiva College in New York, where she has directed the writing program since 2015. She took her BA from Antioch College and MFA from Bennington College. And Liesl served as a 2018-19 Fulbright Nehru Scholar in Calcutta, India, where she also taught writing at Presidency University. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Review of Books, LitHub, Words Without Borders, Creative Nonfiction, The Rumpus, and Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, among other publications and anthologies. In 2020, Liesl Schwaber was awarded the Donald J. Murray Award in Creative Nonfiction. Welcome, Liesl Schwaber.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the BCLT and Anna and Duncan, and to the other presenters, Supriya, Emily, and Anindo. So yes, in the spring of 2019, I was teaching an undergraduate writing course at Presidency University in Kolkata when a class discussion turned unexpectedly contentious. I had been talking about the importance of concrete nouns in writing, of things that, as the expression goes, can be dropped on your foot. As an exercise, I began an inventory on the chalkboard, asking the students to call out random objects that filled their days: what they ate for breakfast, a commonly used kitchen utensil, something inside their backpacks at that very moment, like a cigarette or an Amitav Ghosh novel, or something they saw on the street on their way to class, a crow or the coconut walla, or a man pulling a cart piled high with tins of mustard oil. I remember saying by way of example that I had walked from the metro that morning through the medical college, surprised to find hundreds, if not thousands, of discarded pills, red and blue tablets of who knows what dumped in the street, and that I'd wondered on my walk if the crows and the pigeons and the street dogs had been nibbling away at the medicines, and if so, what was happening to the animals as a result. The point of the lesson was to explore both the poignancy and the relative ease of naming concrete nouns that, no matter how banal they may appear to us at home, become crucial in writing to illustrate and thereby concretize the worlds and lives we inhabit, allowing readers, regardless of distance or unfamiliarity, to enter that world alongside of us on the page. I had been encouraging the students to imagine a reader who'd never been to Kolkata or India, or who knew nothing of the wonderful bustle along College Street. Writing concretely, I urged, allowed all writers to anchor ideas, illustrate memories, and support claims. And I'd been excited to see the comprehension register on the students' faces, encourage as they continued to talk about the blue jeans, the tea, and the tickets for the ladies' car of the local train on which they depended each day. We watched too as a vibrant portrait of Bengali Gen Z daily life emerged on the board. And in the process, so too did a broader social fabric. In this case, the fulcrum or tension or overlap between tradition and modernity, in which many young adults in India find themselves. And the more specific the words were, the more vivid the reflection of those images became. So I was surprised when one student raised her hand to question the whole endeavor, to express her doubt. To concretize an experience, she exclaimed, might be impossible. Not only that, she added, such an expectation seemed to her a trope of colonial dominance. This work of articulation, a kind of translation, as it were, not only across different languages, but also across time and disparate cultural contexts, might, according to this student, undermine or flatten or misrepresent the experience at best. And at worst, she later elaborated, it could give the reader, in this case me, the false impression of having comprehended something far too big, far too brutal, or far too sprawling or intergenerational to ever be crystallized, something like the trauma of partition. At stake was not only this age-old question of the limitations of language or the impossibility of attempting to convey that which remains unimaginable, even or especially for those who endured such upheaval, but also this potentially vapid sense of witness or empathy on the part of the reader. This expectation or sense of entitlement to that upheaval. As the student herself later wrote, she bristled against the implication that such biblical mayhem or the plight of refugees over newly wrought borders could ever be, in her words, understood as seamlessly as tea and biscuits. I should say here that this class was structured like a typical American writing workshop. In this case, we were focused on the development and the revision of personal narrative, in which the students were pulling from their own lives, integrating historical or social research for context, and writing for the imagined audience of, yes, a global Anglophone audience. And so at the time, I believed that at least some of this student's resistance to my emphasis on concrete description was a matter of rhetorical difference. As a young, serious scholar, she was more familiar with the more conceptual work of critical theory and textual analysis, whereas I was teaching a different genre for a different purpose, essays for a general reader. However, this is not to say that I dismissed her concerns or that I was blind to or untroubled by the potentially problematic or at least thorny dynamics of the classroom. I was an American professor on a Fulbright in Kolkata, and teaching writing is a messy exchange in any context, including in the US, but especially in 21st century India, where English is widely considered a class as much as a language. This was also presidency, formerly Hindu College, founded in 1817, an English language college for Bengali students for over 200 years. The fact of which meant that all of us, the students and I together, were at once inheriting and perpetuating all sorts of historic complexities. At the same time, though, I was ideally teaching in service of the students' own voices, framing the pedagogical value of the writing process as multifaceted. Writing in the first person often allows for new insights and connections that we can't necessarily anticipate or make before attempting to write through an experience. The recursive process of revision requires navigating the flexibility of meaning, encountering the sometimes bewildering fact that significance must be forged and not assumed. And ultimately, writing is a social act by which we create something between and among us. As I have long argued, as young adults in particular write about their own lives with a consideration of the larger social forces that have shaped those lives, they become that much more well-positioned to now impact those same forces in turn. Writing creates a means of empowerment. All of which is to say that although I'd been eager to avoid or at least not reinforce what on first glance might appear to recreate the colonial dynamic of the Western teacher and her Indian students, I also didn't expect, of all things, for concrete nouns to become a flashpoint of these questions of untranslatability. And this student skepticism has in some form preoccupied me ever since, not least of all because I'm currently in the early stages of developing a writing workshop to take place in Kolkata. But I also found myself thinking of this exchange recently because when an Indo so generously invited me to participate in this discussion, my first reaction was while I was so excited to listen to everyone else, I thought I myself would make for an unlikely contributor. Although I hope to learn Bangla during the second half of my life, I have not yet made much headway. I'm not a translator, and as someone who teaches writing, I'm not even a professor of literature in the traditional sense. And yet, as an educator, I do, of course, traffic in the complexities of translation all the time, not only in Kolkata, but also in my work as a writer, professor, and occasional editor in the US, where I endeavor to share with an American audience some of the wonders and brilliance of both contemporary and historic Bengali literature. And so I come to the table today reflecting on these questions of untranslatability from various angles, but primarily as an educator, teaching from both sides of the writing process and on both sides of the globe. As Dr. Apter has established, the endeavor of world literature looks to deprovincialize the canon, particularly as she crystallized, draw on translation to deliver surprising cognitive landscapes. I love this line because, of course, ideally as readers, we do gain glimpses not only into other lives and other ways of being, but also other dimensions of consciousness and imagination. I can only imagine that everyone here at this meeting right now fell in love with literature because a character thought so differently from you that you yourself began to think differently as a result. Or that a poem heightened your awareness of the wind or the grass so skillfully that your entire attention was redirected. Or that a connection over a piece of literature made for a shared experience that couldn't have happened any other way. Just a few days ago, I had a taxi driver from Bangladesh. And while we were stuck on the West Side Highway the day before Thanksgiving, we talked instead of Qazi Nazrul Islam and the poem Bidrohi. Sharing this literary reference, even or especially in translation, shifted our interaction. And the poem itself created a different way for us to be together, a way to step outside of our respective reductive roles of supply and demand. And yet, I too share in the concern that in the current era of American late capitalism and the commodification of higher education, the study of world literature, almost by default, is at risk of becoming yet another transaction of consumption. By no fault of their own, many young Americans arrive at university today unable to imagine a world in which anything is not immediately available for purchase, as if singularly designed for their pleasure, self-actualization, or possession. I say this not in some dismissive shrug of kids not from a dismissive shrug of kids these days, but rather with the deep despair that comes from attempting to safeguard meaningful education when aggressive capitalism, hostile individualism, unrelenting social media, and 24/7 online shopping have collided so disastrously that many young people in the US cannot imagine a poem or a book or even a word that might in fact be untranslatable, that anything might be beyond or outside of what can be instantly consumed for an education that, as far as many undergraduates and administrators are concerned, exists purely for the sake of personal success. In other words, I am quite concerned that even when many American undergraduates are presented with the wonders of surprising cognitive landscapes, the larger social context is such that those landscapes become something to acquire, a way to reinforce self-absorption rather than to disrupt it. And yet, of course, we all know that the answer is never to not read or teach or translate. The answer is never to throw up our hands or to walk away. And so I want to come back to that presidency student and read here a brief passage from her final project for my class. In short, her essay was about her grandmother, and by the discovery during the semester we were working together of 2 tin trunks, which had accompanied her family in their journey from East Bengal in or not long after 1947. In the trunks were her grandmother's journals, which included recipes, the price of fish in the market, and notes such as that the water was harsher in Kolkata than her native Mimensing, and that vegetables boiled differently, which mattered not only in terms of taste, but also in terms of how much gas was required to cook. But her grandmother also articulated her interior life, including the perhaps universal question that becomes all the more poignant during partition. Nari shadi nota jinishta ki. What does freedom convey for women at all? Having unearthed these trunks in these journals, the student came to see me, and we discussed how she might build an essay around them. She later referred to that very conversation in her essay, writing, "If I were to concretize the existence of those trunks, their genealogy, for lack of a better word, the history they tow along in wake, an exercise that has often found favor with our professor in Presidency University, Kolkata, I would most definitely be incapable of delivering upon that one term, concretize. What do I concretize? From where do I concretize? Furthermore, she asked of the trunks and their contents, what was or am I supposed to do with them? Of course, I can assure you that what this student did was craft a beautifully sophisticated and powerful essay, a piece of writing that both vividly illustrated a snapshot of her family, as well as called into question the very expectation that such a snapshot could ever be mistaken for a three-dimensional portrait. But her questions get at the heart, I believe, of our questions. What do we do with the trunks of stories or poems or lived experiences that we've all either packed up and carried ourselves, or that we're looking to unpack, to translate in order to share with others? In preparing these remarks for today, I emailed the student to ask her permission to refer to her essay, describing how much her questions continued to resonate with me. Her name is Sneha, and she immediately wrote back, generously agreeing to my request. She also told me that she has recently finished her MA, and in her email she wrote, I've been telling our juniors about your classes, and believe me, your advice to concretize has done wonders for me. And so I'll end here, holding in my heart both Sneha's quite adamant resistance to the notion that, for instance, the experience of being an unbastu, a displaced or uprooted person, could ever be truly concretized, as well as her recognition that the same process of lovingly and mindfully attending to each word and each object does wonders for our ability to read, to write, and to translate, as we strive to better understand for ourselves what it is we wish to share and why. Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned Sneha's beautifully sophisticated and powerful essay. I might say the same. Thank you for adding more perspectives to our approach to this problem, to thinking about your pedagogical experience and your experience in the context of creative writing, problematizing the concrete and drawing attention to and reflecting on the constructedness of the concrete, and as you were saying, which perhaps one might not otherwise expect to be a kind of locus of the untranslatable. We have one final speaker, and it's my pleasure to introduce now Emily Apter. Professor Apter completed her BA at Harvard University and her MA and PhD at Princeton on comparative literature, focusing on 19th and 20th century French, British, and German literature, theory, and history of literary criticism. Between 1993 and 2002, she taught at University of California, Los Angeles, and at Cornell University. And since 2002, she's been Silver Professor of French and Comparative Literature at New York University. And she was appointed President of the American Comparative Literature Association in 2017-2018. Emily Apter has made major contributions to discussions on translation theory, comparative literature, and world literature with her books, The Translation Zone, A New Comparative Literature from Princeton in 2006, Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability from Verso in 2013, through her editing of the English language version of Barbara Cassin and team's Dictionary of Untranslatables in 2014, and through her editorship of the book series Translation, Transnation for Princeton University Press. Her Unexceptional Politics appeared from Verso in 2017, and she's currently working, as I understand it, on her next book on translating in-equality, equivalence, justness, rightness, equilibrity. And we're delighted that she could join us this afternoon in the UK, this morning on the East Coast, and to respond to our previous speakers, but also with remarks of her own. Professor Apter.
Thank you so much, Duncan, and to all of the panelists, especially Anindya, for that wonderful and profound engagement with my work. The whole question of the politics of untranslatability is very, very important. I think it's been the through line to all of the work I've done on translation, and what he and the others on this panel are doing to extend how we think about the politics of untranslatability, including primarily, I would say, as a pedagogy, as a praxis. I've run into trouble with people thinking, oh, well, you're just against translation, you don't want it to be done. Duncan reminded us of our debt to Cassin's notion of it's what you keep on, in parentheses, not translating, in the sense that you never feel that you've arrived at an ending, but that it's an endless process, a labor, a work, but also a form of relationality to languages and to their strangeness, and to the sense that every time we take too seriously that there is such a thing as a discrete or a vehicular language, we're thinking in terms of the sovereign boundaries of a language. Whereas in fact, language in its living context is never a fixed thing. I mean, this is something of a truism, but it leads to the view of literatures of the world, languages of the world as being, in a sense, in dynamic relation to each other, dialectic, violent, sometimes loving, but it's these modes of relationality and intra, as opposed to just interlingual connection that is part of what is motivating, animating my thinking about translation theory these days. And when I think about translation and justice, which is a field that, of course, has been defined in large part by the brilliant and difficult work of those who translate for The Hague, or who are involved in legal translation in the sphere of international law, or local territory disputes, or say the claims of an indigenous people to a land, a culture, and a language. This has been, in some ways, a sphere of technical translation hived off from the larger theory of translation. But I'm trying in the next move, in the next project on translation, to see where questions of justice come into it. How do you, we've spoken a lot about linguistic non-equivalencies, and I'll say just a couple of things about that in a minute, but not very much about what it would mean to do a kind of equal translation. When there are conditions, as Supriya noted, of when there are historical and political conditions that make translation a form of hegemonic imposition, or introduce questions of cultural erasure, or the regulation of languages, in a sense, the colonial structure of linguistic relations, all too difficult to overcome. How do you introduce a category of what I think of as justicing in language? How do you do that? Now, I think we heard something about that. There are various techniques, and if we come back to the question of pedagogy and praxis for justicing or introducing equality into language politics. One of them, very straightforwardly, that's been alluded to, is to be very conscious of the way in which hegemonic languages control the flow of translation. What languages are being translated towards another? What is the relationship of the source culture to the, say, the publishing network or the distribution network of the target? And what would be some techniques for resistant translation? This was alluded to in the discussion. Well, we talked about marking conditions of non-equivalence. How does one go about that? How does one equalize conditions of translation? How does one prevent what Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak calls translation as violation? Well, we can't really, but we can think in terms of a model of making equal. How do you, in a sense, subtract from a quote, a supposedly level playing field. One technique that Spivak and others have introduced is one of, in a sense, withholding translation. So in Spivak's introduction to Breast Givers, she says, she cites a phrase about water carriers who are in a caste of menial task performers. And she says, there is no equivalent term in English, and so I have chosen not to translate it. So this would be a technique of withholding or subtracting from a translation and reminding an Anglophone reader that they are not just entitled to think they have access. It's an active subtraction, if you will. It's a marking of a deficit that reminds the reader that if you're a cultural tourist who thinks that the translation is giving you some sort of comfort with another language that you don't know, think again, think again. It's a putting the brakes on this kind of non-self-consciousness of the reader, who at some level buys into the assumption that the translation has given them access to the culture, to the language. It's not to say that it's not translatable in any absolute sense. You can keep translating it and come up with approximations. Languages are translated. No one is denying that. But there are these tactics of resistance that are to do with putting on the brakes, reminding people that there are, I think of it, voids around the solids. Voids that are around the solids that are putting pressure on in a sense, an epistemic comfort zone. That make uncomfortable, that make strange, that and that in a sense make equal by subtracting from the supposed equal, from the supposed equivalence. It's a kind of new math, and it grows out of a couple of questions that I've been dealing with, which I'll just read one little paragraph that has been preoccupying me in terms of this question of justicing in language. How has a reparative practice stirred new pedagogies in the comparative humanities and become integral to disciplinary formations? How do we decolonize translation or the field of translation studies? In an era rightly antithetical to speaking for the other, translation as a mode of re-saying or putting words in the mouths of conquerors is suspect, regarded as a form of colonial appropriationism steeped in histories of conquest, proselytism, and cultural property theft, as well as, I would add, climate injustice. I would really like translation to be ethically valid as a form of resistance to linguistic appropriation, nativism, ethnocracy, and the constriction of thinking, which is a kind of parochialism that comes with a monolingual worldview. But as we know, principled ethics fall short in dispelling the risk of what Spivak has called translation as violation. With translation, it's well nigh impossible not to commit injustice on the other's estates, not to reproduce ethnographic attitudes of offending curiosity on the order of tourist voyeurism and colonial object fetishism. But as I argued in Against World Literature on the politics of untranslatability, when it comes to translation studies and world literature, it's hard to avoid violating the sanctions of original texts or words, committing acts of epistemicide. So these are the sort of dilemmas that one has to grapple with. Does that mean one doesn't try? No. I do think that, as we've already heard today, playing with strategies carefully of withdrawal, subtraction, withholding, resisting appropriationism, and sometimes just by marking where you're coming from in relation to an author, becoming much more attentive to specific contexts and where things are being extracted from, what their uses were. Some of these are parts of what we might think of as an ethical praxis, but do we ever surmount all the problems that were alluded to around deficit and surplus, and debt? No, and I think these are very difficult questions to negotiate. Also, the conditions that were alluded to about when something becomes read or becomes visible. These are very hard to predict or control, but I thought it was very interesting to think about, you know, the difficulty, say, of a Bengali modernist text. Has it reached its moment of visibility now? Well, yes, but there's also, one could say, another debate that's going on in I think in its North American version, it's probably very different from, say, how it's being debated in the subcontinent, but this would be, well, how does this relate to Dalit poetry or Dalit writing? You know, is there a caste structure and elitism around the Bengali modernism that will, in a sense, contribute anew to resistance to it because of its kind of elite or upper class legacy? And this, you could say, it's a parallel discussion is going on with relation to high modernism and how we read texts of high modernism, even those engaging, as with Eliot, Pound, and all of them, in very interesting ways with vernacular, say with idioms of English and vernacularization that were considered very radical at the time, but that still, in a sense, have become in the canon encased in a kind of elitism. And then the questions, of course, of class versus caste or race. In North America, there are a lot of ready analogies between the exclusions of caste in language and the exclusions of race in language, and class kind of mediating between the two of them. Now, this is another meta order of translation. Can we translate the American critique, anti-colonial critique of, say, indigenous languages to, say, Africa, where they don't talk about African languages as indigenous languages? They are African languages. It's a very different history. So these are a kind of meta order of translation difficulty between, say, indigenous and native, or race and caste. And none of this maps easily onto the other, but in the larger picture of trying to imagine an ethical praxis or a reparative translation, they enter into, because one draws, one is a translator, one draws from these different discourses of decolonial or anti-colonial, of regional North-South politics, say in Gramsci's vision of and reclaiming of dialect, and in terms of the global south of Italy versus north. Does that map onto global south in the way we're using it now? There's another meta order of translation. So I would say that within the theory of translation, there are all these other kind of questions that arise in terms of what you draw from, what kind of bricolage do you do theoretically to come up with a theory of compensations or damages for language theft, for the theft of cultural properties or of cultural patrimony or violations of religious practices that treat languages as untranslatable in their context. So these are some of the questions that occurred to me as I was listening to these incredibly rich presentations and interventions. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you for responding so closely to the others' presentations. You've raised again so many issues which I'm sure our fellow panelists and our audience members will be interested to pick up on. So can I just say at this point to our audience, do please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll come on to those in a moment. But can I open up for responses within the panel, firstly, to any of your fellow panelists' remarks which you would like to come back on? Can I open up to all of our speakers? Yes, Shupriya.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Emily. That was wonderful. And, thank you, Liesl, too. But I particularly admired the way in which you brought Dalit politics and the politics of translation with respect to what gets invisibilized within a culture. Right at the end, you brought these questions up, and they are very important with respect to Bengali modernism, certainly, and it's absolutely an unerring, distinction that you made there about the fact that high modernism in Bengal is certainly also a kind of high caste practice. And so, when we look back at the literature of the era, there is a great deal that we need to sift through and understand. There's a great deal of other writing that is coming, that is there, and that needs to be made visible within the canon of Bengali modernist writing. Yes, it's a very, very important point, and a point that needs to be made when we consider the writing of that period. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much to everyone for the intervention and the valuable comments on it. To Emily's wonderful observation and comments, I have a couple of questions, observations to learn from you. You mentioned about the Haigs and people who are working at the Haigs, and I think and you began by talking about translation as pedagogy or as a practice, as an ethical practice that can compensate the different problems within the systemic discriminations that we have. You also mentioned, as Shupriya just said, about Dalit literature or the caste system in India. Liesl was also talking about the concrete, objects around the realities of India, which are all inscribed in these class caste, structures of power relations. Now, when you talk about the Haigs and the ethical practice of translation, you have already mentioned about translation as reparation or translation as justice. So are we also talking about translation as human rights in that way, since you mentioned about the Haigs? And that connects me to Barbara Cassin's dictionary. Although, to be fair to Cassin, and you have also mentioned it in your introduction to the dictionary, that it has a plan to open up to other languages, although at its current stage, it is very much focused to European languages. So, can you say a little bit more about the future plans when this dictionary can complete the project in the real sense of the term, by incorporating terms and ideas, philosophical ideas, poetic ideas from other cultures and other linguistic practices? And my last question is about the point that you mentioned about the bricolage, the strategy that we can adopt to compensate for the damages that we have caused because of this neoliberal policies of incorporating different cultural items as part of the multicultural syllabus that we call world literature. So Could you please specify more on that, the bricolage that you referred to? Could you please concretize further on that? Because that would help us to understand it in a better way. Thank you.
Okay, well, let me start with the human rights. Those very brief answer is that I think the arena of human rights, which are aligned with NGOs, and they are both an absolutely crucial infrastructure for creating world linguistic encounter. You know, this is something that is absolutely vital, and otherwise I think there would be only English or, you know, a few dominant languages in which adjudications of human rights would be conducted, which would necessarily put many cultures at not just at a disadvantage politically, but also beyond in a sense, beyond the pale of expressibility or articulation, because certain terms, some have entered into more mainstream usage, like Ubuntu from South Africa, and the unity of peoples, and that's a very rough and violent translation, but others have not at all. And this is something, for example, that in organizations or NGOs that may have some connection to international law in, say, ecology, run into trouble, because a group will implant, it will be English speaking, and it won't understand a certain taxonomy of native cosmos, a way of naming that isn't just about the nouns not having an equivalent. It's about a relationship to the naming itself, or to the phenomenology of body orientation, to a landscape. I use the term volcanic planetarity in relation to a text that was translated from Hawaiian. It was a 19th century missionary who took it on himself to write a complete kind of encyclopedic ecology of Hawaii, and you know, it's a long and complicated story, but the translation has been done absolutely brilliantly, not just by a team that was concerned with getting it accurate, but with notes about discrepancies and sort of a bilingual text. So just as you read today, you didn't translate line by line. The point is you created an encounter with something that we would have to, in a sense, grasp only by ear, without access to a kind of, you know, a semantic portal. And it's a way of saying, of practicing resistant translation, but opening up access to something else, which is the beauty of the sound, the meter, the music of the language, which if you're reading it in translation without the benefit of either seeing it or hearing it, you will not appreciate at all. And the point is that these aren't just extraneous or collateral elements to a translation. They are essential to its being, to what it is. We can never begin to get even to that place if we're just restricted to a translation that is purely lexio, you know, it's just simply a text on a page. So I think that this whole question of the human rights model is both, I think, absolutely essential for world justice. And I believe, without being a universalist, that we can aspire to forms of world justice that are planetary primarily, that is a kind of commons, just as you could talk about a dialectal commons or a vernacular commons, where there are, in a sense, artificial boundaries put around it, but that there is some sort of commons, which is not to say the same thing as there's world literature, which has been, I think, compromised by the as you've all discussed, the neoliberal economics of publishing and pedagogy. So if we were to do for example, a dictionary of climate justice, or a dictionary of planetarity, that would take on, I've got background noise, sorry, a certain kind of ecosophy or philosophy of ecology across cultures and continents, you would have to be attentive to the fact that terms that do not fit any kind of equivalence model, terms that mark a native territory or sacred land or water, don't translate in this way, that they would have a plethora of terms, and that's what you would have to somehow work with. And that's the problem of the NGO human rights one size fits all model, the World Court. You can't do without it, but it has a long way to go to become a form of justice making, because it creates these kinds of assumptions about how to help a community, but without taking seriously the limitations of the very vocabulary of climate justice that are built into Anglophone models of it. So that's one thing I would stress, and that leads me to your second question about how to remake the Dictionary of Untranslatables. We took out from its original title, which was in French, it was Le Vocabulaire Européen des Philosophies, Dictionnaire des Intraduisibles. You can see we took the subtitle, made it the main title, and then we took out the word European. Now, we've been criticized for that, but the Cassin herself, who came up with it, was absolutely on board with this. In fact, thrilled to get rid of European. She said it was primarily there because it was a EU-funded project and they had to do that. But she never wanted it to be restricted to Euro languages. And we've been frustrated for primarily material reasons and copyright reasons from making it into a wiki that would become a really, truly dynamical site in which people would fully introduce, critique what's there. I say it's a kind of parlor game to look at what's missing. The English edition is somewhat different from the French edition because certain terms that were considered untranslatable in French weren't really at all in English, and it wasn't that interesting we thought, like, okay, happening, the idea of a happening, that's not all that interesting as an untranslatable. I mean, excuse me, I'm actually going to move so that I can hear myself think. But so this is something that we could say is a work we hope will happen in the future. But it's been the Seuil, the publisher, and not Princeton, actually, the English one. And I'm not sure in terms of the translations of the dictionary into other languages, and there are now quite a few, what the copyright conditions are. But the only thing truly, thank you, the only thing truly impeding the setup of a wiki, well, there are two things. One is that we need an international team to manage it. You can't just, I think, have it entirely open. I mean, one could experiment with that, but to make it, in a sense, a world democratic instrument of knowledge and rethinking concepts and doing concept work, that would take probably a team from all over the world to be on board. And I tried at the very beginning to assemble that team, and I was doing pretty well with it. And it unfortunately got shut down by Le Seuil, by the French publisher. But it will eventually, if there's interest, it could eventually happen with the way in which data mining and technology is moving. There really is no reason for it, or at least experimental offshoots. And then the third question, what was that again? Can you remind me?
Yes, it relates to the strategy of bricolage that you referred to. You mentioned about subtraction and withholding. So could you please concretize further, and how you can also connect it to the question that I initially posed about your concluding remarks in your introduction on how the challenge of negotiating between Badiou's hypertranslation and Cassin's idea of linguistic relationality, because that is the challenge that we face. So how to resolve that question? So if you can throw more light on that, that would also help. Yes.
Well, one model for this bricolage is the work of an Algerian artist named Kader Attia, who's based in Berlin and Paris to some extent now. But he did this whole question. He did a whole project that involved sort of stitching a mirror. Stitches on a mirror. How do you stitch a mirror? And what was interesting is that the idea behind it was that you go into the ethnographic museum, and instead of just putting together African statues, curios taken from another culture, a Western assemblage, basically, or revisiting the ethnographic museum, if you will, that contains within it a history of violent colonialism and appropriation, that you don't just simply condemn such assemblages out of hand. You take another look at them, and instead of focusing on just the kind of the bizarre juxtapositions, which led to a kind of visual titillation or exoticism, or the replay of certain Orientalisms. The idea is to really look at the way in which there's a kind of wounded legacy in the stitches themselves that are mirrored, so that it's in a sense a bricolage with sutures in it, with stitches that mark places where things have not healed, where there is not in a sense, the growing over of the tissue, and where each crevice that has been sewn up is in a sense this invitation to look at traumatic history, and also to think about, and this gets back to what I was saying at the end about the sort of meta translations that go on, how you might bring a notion of reparation as repatriation of the impossibility of repatriation. I mean, what does it mean to really bring something back to a culture? Does a culture ever own a cultural property? Do we really own our language? I've been very torn, in a sense, by the tensions between, in a sense, wanting to respect a native claim to a form of cultural property that signals belonging and identity, versus and respecting, in a sense, its off limits, its untranslatability in that sense, and a kind of skepticism towards cultural ownership and linguistic ownership, which would lead towards this idea of a dialectal commons. This was a theory very, very popular in the heady days of the Russian Revolution, that there would be, you know, a cosmoglossia, a lingua franca that that in a sense did away with the kinds of class and cultural hierarchies of the world, and that was an approach to language that saw it more as a linguistic commons where ownership claims or in a sense cultural exclusive rights would not be exerted. So this is a huge tension for me. And I have to go, my technique is to go it's case by case, to try to not generalize in one way or another. It's that, but it leads to a kind of inconsistent landscape of the politics of translation. It's like certain things I would apply, like the violent appropriation of the Chickasaw word for river by William Faulkner in Yoknapatawpha County, is an appropriation for Southern Gothic, in a way, and modernism of an Indian river in that place. And Faulkner makes a very strange analogy between the dispossession of the Chickasaw tribe of its river and the dispossession of the Confederate South by Northern troops. And I'm like, what? That is a really impossible equivalence. He's basically, I'm in New York, you've got every siren going now. That's the soundscape that's interfering with the language. Maybe in a good way, but you know, so bricolage in that sense would be dealing also with these contradictions, with these tensions between belonging and not belonging, between the right to and the right not to.
Thank you so much. We are, I'm afraid, running out of time here, but we have, I wonder if we could take one question from our audience. There's a question from Shagufta Shamin, which is directed specifically to Anindya. Shagufta has been the Visible Communities translator in residence at the National Centre for Writing in Norwich. But I wonder if we could take a more general question from Supendra Bhowmik, who says, thanks a lot to all speakers. Can we think of a difference between opacity and invisibility around the political issue of translation? When something remains untranslated, the source text remains just opaque. While when someone tries to translate and thereby transcend the language hiatus, it might be a case of mistranslation or deliberate stroke non-deliberate and occlusion or anything like that, which is invisibility to me rather than opacity. Can the practice of dropping certain words in original language within a translated text, calling them untranslatable, be a further political move by increasing opacity in addition to invisibility? Can I open that up for any of our speakers to comment on a difference between opacity and invisibility, particularly in this political context?
I think, as I mentioned during my opening remarks, Emily herself has focused on that how this opacity is related to the untranslatable that Barbara Cassin mentioned, and how it borders on to you know, the sublime or to the CISO language that Emily referred to. So I think it would be better if Emily can answer on this. She's the best person to talk on this.
I actually think Supriya addressed it in, I've spoken so much, maybe she could come on and respond to this question of opacity.
Actually, you know, the question is quite long. And in fact, I think the person who has put the question has understood its subtlety quite well himself, actually. I mean, I'm not very sure whether it's a comment or a question, because the difference between opacity and invisibility, to me, is that, I mean, at least the way that I use the words visible and invisible, we're very firmly in the political terrain of seeing something or not seeing it. And as a result, not acknowledging its presence. Now, within a language, when doing translation, things may also become invisible. That is to say, I don't see a difficulty and therefore I am unable to tackle the nuance of a particular set of words or an object or whatever. So there could be an invisibility inside the text, as well as a larger invisibility within the political or cultural terrain. In the case of opacity, opacity seems to me to belong very much within the text. It doesn't seem to be a term that one could use about the larger political or cultural terrain at all. Or at least it doesn't, I mean, one could, of course, but I mean, it doesn't seem to me an obvious thing to do. It seems to me that within the text, opacity is everywhere. There are, there's so much that isn't directly accessible, that remains blurred, that remains shadowy. Sometimes it's our duty to keep it like that. I mean, as translators, and we must always remember that as translators, our work is never done. That's something that both Onindo and Emily have said absolutely brilliantly, that we're always in the process of translating. Any translation that I might do will be overwritten, overlain by somebody else's translation. And whatever I've done is an unfinished work. It's in process. So things in the text will remain opaque because I'm not able to remove the screen, which is a screen of language also, that is in front of those things. Liesl actually also spoke about that. Maybe Liesl would like to come in at this point. Liesl?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I have to add, but I agree absolutely with this process of it being ongoing, right? The thinking of text as dynamic and evolving, not only across languages, but across readership. So I think I'll just end there. Thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I might add is that sometimes opacity is taken as a term of non-coevalness. And as, in a sense, it's a kind of fetishism of otherness that's attached to some cultures and not to others. And that's the bad opacity. But there's the one that has been claimed by Edouard Glissant in his Poetics of Relation, which is that it's a form it's an enabling kind of term for cultural knowledges that have different modes of relation to each other. It's the way that the inarticulate or the not yet said or the not translated interact with what is said. And for him, it's, I think, linked to what he calls a kind of archipelagan model of community. And it's interesting if you take this into concrete terms, because the Caribbean archipelago is bizarrely kind of separated and divided by language, and according to histories of cultural conquest. So you would have Hispanophone islands, Anglophone islands, Dutch speaking, and French speaking, just to mention some, English speaking, but you wouldn't have many relations among them. It was, in a sense, the language was divided. But what was interesting, I think, in Glissant's model was to introduce, in a sense, the geopolitical and the territorial into as a form of, and it was what separates the islands that becomes the space of work, which was this untranslatability factor. They were not communicating across languages, let alone across creoles.
I think, thank you all. I think that's a great place to...
Duncan, I'm sorry to interrupt, because there was one question which I think I need to briefly just respond to, which was about my including poets like Jasimuddin and Najrul as part of the Kallal group. I think the best anthology, Bengali anthology on the Kallal era poets is a book called Kallal Kobita Somogro, which is an anthology edited by someone called Arun Mukhopadhyay, and it contains the poems by Jasimuddin and Najrul. So they're very much part of the Kallal era poets. Just to respond to that. That's all.
Thank you, Anindya. I think we've dotted the I's and crossed the T's now. Thank you to all our audience for your questions and your responses in the chat. But above all, thank you so much to our 4 panelists today for a really rich and wide-ranging discussion, and it really crowns the fascinating residency of Anindya at BCLT over these last few months. So thank you all, and we will draw things to a close there. And we have been recording this session, and it will be appearing on the BCLT YouTube channel shortly. Thank you all.